Polly is a consulting clinical psychologist and the director of the Gender Identity Development Service, nationally designated service in London, child and adolescent specialist. But she's also working at Great Ormond Street, where she was working with DSD patients. She was published in this area, and she is still involved, I think, in the guidelines in the UK on transgender care. Polly?
It's an honor to be here, and I appreciate it's late in the day, and so I'm very grateful that there are people here. I come from the UK. My badge actually says the Netherlands, which I'm thrilled about, and I hope this is official and I'm not letting go of this badge. As you may or may not know, we are about to have a referendum in the UK as to whether or not we stay in Europe. And this badge might come in handy if people vote in the wrong way, in my view. It would be very much against the spirit of what I'm about to say. So I guess, end of the day, and I don't know about you, but my brain is full to bursting. And I spend the time, whenever I come to conferences, thinking, yes, no, that's absolutely right. And then 5 minutes later thinking, oh gosh, no, that. And my brain is going back and forth. But I think most of what I'm going to say has already been said today by different people, different voices. And I hope that it provides a framework, perhaps, for bringing together some of these very different and passionately held views. So in terms of the service in the UK, this is a slide we made a few years ago for the Festschrift of Domenico De Ceglie, who is an Italian psychiatrist who I know many of you know, who founded the service in 1989, so nearly as old, but not quite as old as the Dutch service, following closely behind. And I guess this graph really is a representation, I think, of the fact that we are embedded in a changing world, and that the work we do and gender itself is intricately connected to politics, language, and culture. And there's been change over the time, but some things have changed and some things haven't. And I guess that's the sort of framework of my talk today, which is about what's changed, what hasn't, where are we going now, what does care, what should it look like? In the UK, looking at the young people referred to the service, by far and away the majority of young people who come to the service are over the age of 15. So about 60% of people are over 15 and well into puberty. 83% of the people who come to our service, young people, are aged between 12 and 18. If you look at referrals by age, I had the thought, because we introduced early physical intervention with the hypothalamic blocker in 2011, that we would see an increase in younger people coming forward because we were offering that particular intervention. And indeed, it felt like there was a real increase in younger people coming to the service. However, when we looked properly at the numbers, actually there's not been an increase in younger people coming forward. And the distribution of ages coming forward to the service over the years, as this graph represents, have stayed fairly steady. And I guess that raises some really interesting questions. For me, it raises one question about checking out one's thoughts. I was really convinced that there were more, but actually that isn't the case. And so data and a foundation of data is vital in order to inform the way forward. But I guess also maybe it says something about, is there more work to be done? Are the older adolescents coming forward to our service a different group? Or are perhaps they a group who could have come earlier had there been the environment for them to do so? So I think after this year, which has been named in the UK as the year of transgender, a very important year, I think maybe we may see a change in the ages of young people being referred to us, but we'll need to wait and see. one of the things for us as a national service for the whole of the UK, although there is a service, separate service, a great service in Scotland, and Gordon's here from Scotland, and also a service in Belfast, is equity of access. Clearly, where you have services, specialist services located in centres, it's important to be spreading the word across the country to ensure that there is equity across the country and not just where the services are located. Our model has always been a network model, so we've always provided care whereby we feel it's really important to go into young people's locality, to meet with the schools and the CAMs that they may be involved with, which is the Child and Young People Mental Health Services, and also GPs. And part of that is about education and informing people about gender, but part of that also is very much about recognising that children are whole beings. They're a mind and a body, and we need to be attending to those needs in a holistic way. So we have shared care with child and adolescent mental services around the country, and also GPs for physical interventions. But as a service, we've always felt that training and conferences are really important. And indeed, we have several conferences around the country now with a third sector group for teachers and GPs. So I think educating health workers, primary health workers, is key, and we would see that as part of our role. The service has grown. In 2011, a second centre was set up in the north of the UK in Leeds, and that has now moved to bigger premises and has more staff and is growing too and developing its own identity. We also have endocrine clinics in London, but also in the north. And increasingly, we have outreach virtual clinics around the country, depending on where there's need. So there's a well-established clinic in Exeter, thanks to the generosity of the adult gender service in Exeter, but also in Cardiff, Brighton, and other parts of the UK. We're actively collaborating with the third sector. I guess I come from the UK with an NHS, and I appreciate we have different health systems, but certainly the development of youth groups, the voice of young people themselves being heard and coming together, but also voluntary groups working with young people, I think are becoming more and more important as health resources become scarcer and scarcer. In terms of the referrals, I think we've been quite successful in our strategy to gain equity. When the service was first nationally commissioned in 2009, the majority or a large number of referrals came from around London. And certainly now London is represented in proportion to the number of the population living in London. And so, I think that's a positive thing. As with many other services, we have seen a massive increase in referrals. So in 1989, the service started in St George's Hospital in London. There were literally 1 or 2 referrals. I joined about 18 years ago. We were operating from a broom cupboard in an adult service at the Tavistock that was working with forensic patients. Absolutely inappropriate, but somehow it was possible. And quite frankly, we had to take the space that we were given. We were then went up in the world and had a porter cabin in the car park. That was nice. You could be in close connection with the weather in the porter cabin, inside the porter cabin, as well as when you walked outside it. But now we are part of the main building. We have been taken in, embraced. At this moment, our colleagues are looking at how they can give us more rooms. And so I think, this is a reflection of the way in which gender has risen up the agenda and that it now has a place in people's minds. However, with increased referrals come a lot of issues around waiting lists. And we have worked incredibly hard since 2009 not to breach our so-called referral to treatment time of 18 weeks, which we didn't. But now we are sadly in a position where we are. We have had a 100% increase in 1 year that has really been quite difficult to deal with. So in terms of the rapid growth in referrals, I think it was unprecedented and unexpected. Why last year? What happened last year that suddenly there was a confluence that came together that raised awareness, and I think then affected our referrals? Nothing but positive in many ways. In the UK, certainly, there has been huge amounts of media interest. Of 160 inquiries to our foundation trust, 140 of them were to our service with interest around gender. So there's been increased visibility in the media, but I think also for young people, as anyone knows, working with young people, there's huge amounts of information of variable quality, it has to be said, on the internet, and access to information and support through social media. And there's also, as I say, increased awareness of physical treatments. And I think this has actually contributed to a greater awareness and understanding and acceptance, to a degree, a destigmatization, which we still have a long way to work on. And hopefully it's easier then for families and young people to seek out care. And I think it's also been supported by individuals who are willing to come forward, brave enough to come forward and have a voice. Third sector groups who are coming together to provide a space for young people to come together with gender variance and with legislation. As I said, it's had an impact on waiting lists. And I think we need to be careful to make a distinction between practical issues and clinical, empirical issues. So a practical issue may be that it's simply incredibly difficult to get new staff in short periods of time, because certainly in the UK at the moment, we do not have proper accredited training in gender. And that is changing. We're looking at that. But something perhaps that is not a practical issue is around the difficult questions of timing of treatment. And that is more of a clinical and an empirical issue, which I'll come back to. But I think it would serve us well to be rigorous in separating out where the arguments lie in terms of where we should be focusing our energies. So the UK press have always had an opinion. And for many years, in September, we would come back to work after holidays, and there would be horrendous, every year, horrendous headlines. And these are the least of it. Boy 12 turns into a girl. Shortly after, now boy 9 is a girl. And really, the headlines are often characterized by what's the youngest, the worst thing they can come up with. Invariably, they had no care about language, sex change drugs. So you would spend ages talking to them, trying to educate them, but actually they were just interested in the headline. But behind the headlines were families and young people whom those headlines referred to, perhaps sometimes who had been duped into thinking there was an interest in them, and then ending up on the front page in a rather hideous headline. But things this year have really changed, and I do really believe that we will not be seeing headlines like that. And if we do see headlines like that, there will be more people aware that it is just not on than there are people who are sucked into the message they're giving. We're actually getting some serious articles, some thought. People are giving thought to language. Woman's Hour, which is a national institution in the UK, Women's Hour are being very careful about their language. We're now, though, moving on to a different theme. So the theme now is shock and horror, perhaps, that we're teaching 4-year-olds about gender. And then kids age 4 told to choose gender. But I mean, you know, I think this is a step forward, and actually perhaps is quite positive, because maybe 4-year-olds ought to be taught about gender. And perhaps in terms of the previous talk we had from Valentine, you know, many of the young people we meet with talk about how they've always known they're different, but it takes a television character or something in the press where they put it all together and say, that explains my feelings. So I think perhaps if we start earlier, maybe if there are people who are missing out on earlier treatment, if that's appropriate, they'll be more able to express that. So in terms of the referrals to our service, we've seen a similar trend. There was a paper published last year which looked at Ken, the Toronto, and Peggy and Anna Lou, the Dutch clinic, and found that there had been an increase in assigned females, I think from 2009. We were a bit behind that, but certainly in terms of the number of assigned females and males referred to our service, there has been an increase. So this is a real change, and it's interesting to think about what that might be about. And the recent paper that was published was attributing this perhaps to social type impacts in terms of the stigma of transitioning to a male or a female role. But it's something we need to be following and attending to. In terms of referrals, and this is just looking at last year, we don't see that trend across the different age groups. So in terms of the much younger groups, it's still more assigned males coming forward. And I don't have the answers for this, but I think, they're important trends to note, and I would be interested to talk about it with people. We've talked a lot over the last couple of days about associated difficulties and the distress that young people go through. And of course, we all are here because we have an interest in alleviating distress. Distress is something that, is difficult to see in young children, whether they're your own children or children you're working with. But I think it also has to be noted that many of the young people we see, and we see many, are doing very well, are functioning very well, are at school, are doing really well at school, have lots of friends, are living in their preferred gender, or even unsure about their gender and not living in any particular gender. But we have to hold in mind that there are also many, and particularly in the older adolescents, who present with low mood, self-harm, thoughts of suicide, and rarely, but sometimes even suicide, anxiety, shame. There's still huge problems around bullying, relationship issues, and features of ASD, which I'll come on to in a moment. I mention this because when we look at the young people attending our service, this is representing really, I think, that the assigned female young people we're seeing are showing much higher levels of anxiety than previously, and higher levels of anxiety as compared to the assigned males. And this sort of data is important because it informs what we need to look for, how we need to work. But we also need to be careful when we interpret data, because actually, unfortunately, the levels of anxiety are increasing in general in the UK. So it's not something specific to this group. So we need to see it in a context. I've also mentioned, and this has been well documented, that there is now a well-shown association with ASD-type features in young people presenting with gender dysphoria. And this data is from the group of young people in our service who since 2011 went forward for the early intervention research project looking at the use of hypothalamic blockers. And you see that this really, is a significant issue and is important in terms of us thinking about what are the best ways of working with young people to ensure that we meet their needs, that there's equity of access to treatment. And certainly with moves towards a consent model potentially, where one's thinking about young children, developing young people, perhaps with really quite challenging associated difficulties, consenting to life-changing treatment, I think it is really important that we attend to thinking about how we're working and how we communicate with different groups of young people attending our service. In terms of self-harm, I think this is often talked about and is clearly a really disturbing issue. This data here is just a little bit of data that's picked out relating again to the cohort of young people in our service who have been through to the so-called early intervention clinic. And indeed, self-harm at baseline, this was before they attended the clinic, was there and at concerning levels. But again, we need to be careful how we interpret this. On the right, you'll see some norms from the population, but also some details around self-harm of young people suffering from other mental health conditions such as depression. And, I think we need to keep this in a context We need to be, as we are, striving towards having a more accurate and sophisticated discussions really around gender, and not resort to just quoting figures without putting them in a context. This is clearly something we need to think about, but it's part of an overall complex picture and part of young people growing up in modern society today, as well as perhaps part of life for young people experiencing gender dysphoria. In terms of our service protocol, prevalence is uncertain. Also, the development of gender identity is likely, it seems to be multifactorial, influenced by both biological and social factors. And I always feel like a psychologist when I say that, because I think that's a very psychology thing to say, that things come down to an interplay, that it's not nature or nurture. But I think this is where we are. And I think there was the excellent guidelines produced by the Endocrine Society in 2009 that sought to look at the information we had and grade it in terms of what was the efficacy of the evidence upon which recommendations were based. And I think we have to be honest with ourselves about what evidence there is for the things we may feel very passionately about in terms of moving care forward. So our service is and has been delivered in line with emerging evidence for best practice, but also with guidelines and obviously the standards of care. But certainly in terms of the last time in Bangkok and this time, it's clear that clinical practice is changing rapidly and diverging, and that in many ways we are now not all in line with guidelines. Maybe the guidelines need updating, but I think this is an issue that we need to be thinking about. In terms of service user pathways in our service, I think much of the work we do, and this has been mentioned earlier today, is managing uncertainty of outcome. And, you know, that's not just about whether or not someone will continue to identify in one gender or another or as non-binary. But it's uncertainty, I think, more and more in terms of the choices open to young people, and with whatever gender identity they may have, what they choose to do with that in terms of what might be available in terms of healthcare. But it is true that some people will identify differently or choose to express themselves differently over time. And, you know, I would plead that we hang on to the fact that children and adolescents are not adults and that they are developing beings, and that we need to be thinking about how we work with them and care for them within a developmental framework. So within our service, the pathways are individual and the pathways can change over time. In terms of what we do, I guess just a brief rundown to resonate with what I was saying about equity of access. We have a multidisciplinary team, and we often see the young people in pairs, so their families can be seen separately. We see for an assessment between roughly 3 and 6 sessions, and I will own, I personally would not feel comfortable meeting with a family on one occasion and be recommending physical interventions. We have a network model with liaison with local services, as I've described, but we've also found incredibly valuable group days and family days. And this is really an opportunity for families and young people to not feel so isolated and to gain support from each other in a safe space. We obviously provide physical intervention and referral onto adult services. But our work is very much about whatever a young person's pathway within the service, maintaining a holistic approach so there is ongoing contact with the clinicians in the gender service to promote inclusions, think about relationships and ameliorate negative impacts on general developmental processes, but also crucially to provide opportunities to explore gender identity as a young person develops and perhaps is exposed to other people, different ideas and different ways of being, and think about their expression and then the choices they have and the implications of those choices, both for the present but also for the future. Informed consent, I think moving forward, we're all aware is key and going to be an important, issue. But in terms of some of the things I've mentioned, some of the associated difficulties, the developmental framework, the very different places young people are in, the huge diversity of young people that attends our service, it is hard to start thinking about, but we must, what information is required at what point? Does one need to know about surgery if you're a young person considering cross-sex hormones? If you're thinking about the blocker, do you need to be thinking about cross-sex hormones? You know, we really need to be thinking about what information young people need at what point that is going to be empowering in order to allow them to make these very complex decisions. And I applaud earlier the thought that, you know, it's not about putting the onus on young people to make the decisions. It's about a collaboration and a trust, I would hope, to share those. We're also, as I said, keen to continue with CPD events and wider work, because I believe that the context in which we work, the wider context of society, is going to be crucial in terms of the choices open to young people. And so I do believe that is part of our work. In terms of physical interventions, following assessment, we have a care plan agreed with the young person and family, and we take, according to the guidelines, a staged approach to physical treatments. We offer the blockers from TANA stage 2, and that's based on stage of puberty, not on age. We offer, at the moment, cross-sex hormones from 16 using a gradually increasing dose. And surgery in the UK is not available until adult services. About 40% of referrals to the Child and Adolescent Service go forward to the associated endocrine clinics, so by no means all young people. And about 25% of the prepubertal young people who are presenting to the service prepubertally, that is referred before the age of 12, go forward to the clinic. But it has also to be borne in mind that the majority of referrals, as I said, have already started or are well into puberty. So to end, I just want to raise some points, really, for us to think about. And I suppose, firstly, rationale of the blocker. Are all aspects fully reversible? Is anything really fully reversible? If you don't do something, it has an effect. If you do something, it has an effect. And also, we're working within a developmental trajectory, so things are changing all the time. However, I think we had the view of the blocker as a diagnostic aid. It was also a time to try and alleviate distress, unless I've got this completely wrong, to explore and understand more and consolidate, support young people to be thinking about their next step. It is a reversible treatment, certainly, insofar as if you stop it, then your pre-programmed milieu resumes. But I would question whether it is a completely reversible treatment. We also have the idea that young people should experience some puberty to TANA stage 2. I think that was around the majority of young people presenting to services pre-puberty, not necessarily going forward post-puberty and wanting physical interventions. And so maybe within that, there was some thought that perhaps puberty had a role to play in terms of young people's development, in terms of their sense of their gender identity. I think we all, feel the blocker and physical treatments are crucial and vital and have been the biggest step forward for young people. And certainly their use that was pioneered in Holland has been incredibly successful. But actually, the Dutch are the only team, really, who have published long-term prospective studies about this. So there is very little data available. And also, the data we have is on very wide age ranges. And I guess I was surprised to see, but it makes sense that very recently, in 2015, an excellent paper giving young people a voice, a qualitative study looking at the views of young people, 13 young people aged between 13 and 18, and really was concluding that there is yet no consensus. So I think, around the world, we are practicing very differently. In terms of our service, we've had 44 young people in our early intervention project who were part of a research project, but we've now had 162 young people go forward for early hypothalamic blockers. And the age range reflects the fact that it's by stage of puberty, not their age. But only two have stopped treatment. And in both those cases, they've stopped treatment because they're wanting to explore a different gender identity. One is in a very supportive environment and wishes to try living in a different role without treatment for a while. So I guess there is a question about why so many, why none stop once they've started on the blocker, more or less. And so I guess that begs the question that either we're not putting forward enough young people for this, that there are some people who would benefit from this, who are missing out on this treatment, or that in some way this treatment in and of itself may have an impact and set people on a path. I totally support this treatment, but I think it is about how we conceptualize it and the framework within which it's offered, and I will come to an end. So in terms of our early intervention, I guess the other thing is that our results have been different to the Dutch. We're about to publish these, and we haven't seen any change in terms of psychological well-being and so on. There was a change over time in neutral sex characteristics, but interestingly, this was a change. There was a study done through our service looking at the general population in terms of this, but also there was an increase in dissatisfaction. So it seems to reflect that rather than something specific to this group. I think this is to do with the timing at which we took our measures. But what's more important is that in terms of the qualitative data, all the young people have been resoundingly thrilled to be on the blocker and not wanted to stop, and have found it an incredibly helpful experience. So I will leave you with the questions. What constitutes best care? How is this achieved? And how will care evolve? What is the role and scope of healthcare? Is it assessment, diagnosis, and to provide physical treatment? Or should it also encompass a more holistic view of exploration, of education, of providing space for young people to think about their options over time? I think we need to recognise that healthcare systems are a context, and so different healthcare systems allow different things in terms of treatment. In terms of guidelines, we had a staged approach to give time and space for thought. But I know that there is also a move to, should we be offering cross-sex hormones earlier? Should this be the first part of treatment? We need to, I think, evaluate in research projects consent and eligibility models for cross-sex hormones. I think it's a positive thing to be moving away from age criteria, which were always proxies. But I think if we do move away, we have to think very carefully about how we do this and collect data for the future. We have to remember that most adolescent referrals have been through puberty and the messages we give around treatment in that context. So until more research data becomes available, the optimal timing, I think, is difficult to say. So we're in a rapidly changing landscape. I think we have really come a long way, a huge long way. Not all gender questioning or gender variant young people by any means wish to access health services. And we are moving, I think, towards a society that supports young people feel able to express their feelings around gender. And I think we need to do more of that. But care is evolving, and I suppose my leaving message and something I'm thinking about is that there is an interplay between social context as played out in the media and politics and elsewhere, and the choices young people have. Increasingly, young people who are on early intervention are coming forward and thinking about stopping in order to preserve fertility. And people are making different choices around surgery. We have diverse identities, non-binary and many more, and expression. So we need a consent-based approach to treatment, but we need to be thinking about what information and when. And we need to be thinking about the context in which we're working if we're truly going to give young people choice in terms of what they decide to do. Thank you. Sorry.
Well, thank you very much, Polly, and George as well. Thank you all for your continuous interest during the whole day. It's getting late. There are a few other meetings downstairs and here. I hope you have a nice evening and that you will be tomorrow refreshed back at the other location. Thank you.
Before we really close, please can I have all the presenters up here, because this long day would not have been possible without the fantastic presentations of all these people. So please come up, and I want to thank them all, and the audience also. Boris, Jameson, Taggy, Alex. Yeah. Hi. Hello. Thank you so much. This is for the. Thank you so much. This is for. But. George, thank you. Jameson, thank you. Peggy, no, yeah, Polly for you.
Thank you so much.
Simon, thank you.
No.
And this is
we have to get this space. We have to. We only find this space.
And here we go. There's one more for you. Thank you.
I can wait here.
Yeah, one picture.
Picture.
Let me see you as a too.
Can I?
Oh yeah. And there's the second.
I'm sorry. You're not going to take the mic away from transgender providers. Don't fight me on the microphone. Hi. Okay? Stop it.
Stop it. No.
Please continue your photos. Please continue your photos. In about 5 minutes, and when these photos are done, this room will be a trans-only and non-binary inclusive space. And so we thank you all for being here. If you identify as cis, we do ask that this space become trans non-binary only, as well as the first floor right outside of this space. But do feel welcome to go down the stairs and stay and socialize. But we do ask that this space be cleared for trans-identified folks. Thank you.